Okay. All right. Welcome everybody to this week's meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm your host, Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. If you're tuning in for the first time, this colloquium is an online meeting space seminar that is affiliated with the Peace Science Society. And I run it along with my colleague here at Vanderbilt, Cassie Dorff. And our goal is to bring the great research that happens at each year's meeting of the Peace Science Society, which incidentally is happening now. We're in the lunch break. So hello to anyone out there who's taking a break from peace science for more peace science, to bring that research to you all year long. So our basic format here is straightforward. We'll have a presentation for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion, download some feedback, and we'll try to wrap up by around 1 Central. So I'm really excited for the paper that we're going to be discussing today. We've got Noam Reich, who is a PhD candidate at Princeton University, giving a presentation of a really nice paper called Do States Screen or Signal? We have a great panel of discussants. We have Mark Fay, who's a professor at the University of Rochester. We have Peter Schram, who's an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and Jessica Sun, who is an assistant professor at Emory University. So with that, I'll turn it over to Noam. If you could share your screen, and we'll have about a 15-minute presentation, and then we'll get some feedback on the paper.
All right, thank you. Can you see everything? 1 second. Share. There we go. All right. So 1 second. All right. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers in the audience and the discussants for their time and for being here today. Today I'm going to be arguing that in international crises, states don't convey information by signaling, but rather learn about their rivals through a dynamic screening process. And so without further ado, what's the issue with signaling? So just to refresh everyone's memory, signaling begins with the premise that states have incentives to misrepresent their private information and that this can lead to war. And so that one potential solution to this problem is for resolved or strong states to take costly actions that set themselves apart and convey their willingness to go to war to their rival. Common forms of signaling in the IR literature include sunk costs and audience costs. The problem I'm going to argue is with how signaling often works in practice. So in the paper, I discussed the case of the Gulf War, which began on August 2nd, 1990, when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. And the US responds almost immediately, eventually deploying hundreds of thousands of troops to the Gulf and ultimately successfully advocating for several UN Security Council resolutions against Iraq, including one that authorizes the use of force if Iraq won't leave Kuwait of its own volition. And we would think that these actions, at least per signaling theory, would suggest that the US was very resolved and that an unresolved state would not take these actions. And yet, the day after the UN gives Iraq a deadline for leaving Kuwait, Bush and authorizes the use of force, Bush makes a surprise announcement that though he is not hopeful, he's going to reach out to Saddam and attempt to go the extra mile for peace. The deliberate purpose of this policy was to shore up domestic support for the potential conflict amongst the US population. However, US allies and even members of his own administration began to doubt that the US was sufficiently resolved to go to war, suspected that Bush was looking for an off-ramp, and that he'd be willing to compromise or at least negotiate past the UN imposed deadline. And so the question is, if an unresolved type wouldn't take those actions that Bush had taken and the US had taken, why was there any doubt left regarding US resolve? And what I argue is that the reason that signaling might not seem to work in practice is that there's a fundamental issue underlying signaling theory. And that is that it misrepresents the incentives of the most resolved states. And in particular, it requires the most resolved and the strongest states to invest more, be those most willing to invest in issuing costly signals. the problem is that as you grow stronger or more resolved, your outside option becomes more appealing to you. So going to war is more of attractive an option, and you'd be less willing to settle, invest resources in settling disputes peacefully. And therefore, the strongest and most resolved states should actually be those least willing to invest in costly signals. Elsewhere, I and others have explored or shown that strong or resolved states can still signal if they have some form of signaling advantage, a de facto discount on the costs that they pay for issuing costly signals. The problem is, as reviewers were happy to tell me, is that the moment you introduce additional assumptions like that, the applicability of the theory is reduced and it becomes less universal and therefore less interesting. And so what I'm going to explore in this paper is what happens when you allow for resolved types to be less willing to invest in peace. And I have a few results, and I'm going to focus on the main one today because I have 15 minutes, which is that negotiations become a dynamic screening process. However, there are also other implications, such as you get a theory of delay, or that can explain variation in delay in negotiations, a sort of a theory of endogenous brinkmanship, and sort of novel predictions for behavior in international crises. And so what I'm going to do today is, or how I'm going to move this argument forward, is I'm going to start with a war of attrition model, building on Fearon's 2-exit option war of attrition model. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that negotiations between states resemble a war of attrition, where that ends when states exercise one of 2 exit options. So first, a state can choose to go to war and end negotiations that way, also forcing war upon their rival. Or they can choose to concede and surrender the good or issue being bargained over to their rival. States can delay taking any of these options. And what's going to happen is that states are going to have private information regarding their costs of war, which is going to imply that states are going to be unsure whether their rival prefers to concede or fight, and if and when they will choose to exercise each one of those exit options. The differences between my model and Fearon's is that whereas in Fearon, in his seminal paper, he wanted to show that audience costs could lock states into conflict, and to that end impose severe restrictions against war. By contrast, I want to better represent crises. So I'm going to relax some of those assumptions by introducing some costs for waiting. I'm going to allow states to have positive payoffs for fighting, and I'm going to allow for the potential that states are going to choose to negotiate forever. And the key results, or the way states are going to behave, is as follows. So resolved states are going to be able to go to war at any time. However, they can also choose to delay that going to war and potentially benefit if their rival chooses to concede during that time. However, delay is also costly in that they have to pay some costs for waiting. And so what's going to happen is that the more resolved you are, the better your wartime payoff is going to be, the more impatient you're going to be, and the less chance, or the less willing you're going to be to pay to allow your rival the opportunity to concede peacefully. By contrast, unresolved states are going to be able to concede at any time. And just as with resolved states, delay is potentially beneficial if their rival chooses to concede during that time. However, it's costly, not because these unresolved states mind paying sunk costs less, but what they don't want is to risk war by remaining in the war of attrition and having their rival choose to escalate and force war upon them. And so as a result, what's going to happen is unresolved types are going to be jittery. The more unresolved you are, the worse your wartime payoff is, the sooner or less risk you're going to be willing to incur, and the sooner you're going to choose to exit negotiations. And what's going to happen is that these two processes together are going to allow states to make inferences about their rival's underlying resolve after observing their choice to delay or not. So what's going to happen is states are going to observe that I'm going to, as a state, observe that my rival is going to choose to negotiate another second with me. And I'm going to learn that they must not have been resolved enough to have yet gone to war, but also must have at least been sufficiently resolved to continue negotiating with me. And so formally, the model is going to have the following sort of underlying primitives. Each state's going to have its private information wartime payoff, WI, theoretically decomposable into a common knowledge lottery term P, or how likely each state is to win the conflict, and a private information cost of war component CI. So they're going to have common knowledge CDFs over each other's types. Each country is going to pay audience costs if it chooses to concede. I'm going to assume that following Fear, I'm going to assume that audience costs are strictly increasing so that it becomes progressively more costly to concede the longer the war of attrition persists. And finally, I'm going to assume that states pay some small sunk cost for every second they negotiate up until a point where they don't. So that I'm going to assume that the total sunk costs states pay are capped. And this is equivalent to eventually things settling into a stalemate and countries choosing to stop investing sunk costs into the crisis. Finally, I'm going to assume free entry and free exit, so that choosing to go to war right away imposes no costs or requires no sunk costs, and choosing to concede right away requires no audience costs. Each state is going to observe its private information wartime payoff and is going to choose an exit time and an exit option, omega. So whether they want to go to war, concede, or possibly remain in the war of attrition forever. And for every second states negotiate, there's going to be some you're going to choose an exit time TI. And for every moment up to that time, with some probability, your rival might be a type who chooses to concede, in which case you get the payoff to them conceding, you get the good minus some cost for negotiating up to that time. With some probability, your rival might be a type who chooses to go to war at any given moment, in which case you get your wartime payoff minus the sunk cost for negotiating up to that time. And with some probability, your rival is a type who will choose to exit the war of attrition after you do, in which case you get your payoff to fighting, your pay audience costs if you chose to concede, or possibly you pay the sunk cost forever if you chose to remain in the war of attrition forever. And so the equilibrium is going to look as follows. It's going to begin with, at first, the most result, or no state is going to go to war. The game is going to begin with the peaceful phase. And what's going to happen is almost all states are always going to have an option or some gain to allowing the rival the opportunity to concede peacefully. And during that time, without the threat of war, the most unresolved states are going to play a war, are going to stagger and delay their exit and play a mixed strategy, hoping that their rival is also similarly unresolved and is going to choose to concede first. However, eventually what's going to happen is that the most resolved states are going to be too impatient to remain in the war of attrition any longer and are going to start gradually going to war. This can happen at different time for different states. So in this case, I've assumed that country I chooses to go to war first. Country J has not yet chosen to go to war. And so the unresolved states continue to mix for country I. However, for country J, what happens here is that unresolved states start gradually going to conceding, with the most unresolved states conceding first now that they face a risk of war from country I. And ultimately, country J may also choose to start going to war, in which case its most resolved types start being screened, and the most resolved type still in the war of attrition at any given moment chooses to go to war. Unresolved states continue to concede as they did before, but now the behavior of unresolved types of country I also changes, and they start to concede via pure strategy, with the least resolved state still negotiating, exiting at any given moment. This game persists until the last unresolved state has conceded, at which time states, a mass of types may choose to go to war. And if sunk costs are sufficiently low for remaining in forever, it's possible that some states will choose to remain in forever and pay those sunk costs and settle into a stalemate or status quo where no one exits and the countries are still stuck in the dispute. And so in conclusion, what the model the key element of the model that I chose to focus on from the paper is that negotiations serve as a dynamic screening process, and resolved types are impatient, prefer to go to war earlier to avoid paying the sunk cost required to continue negotiating. Unresolved states, once that happens, will prefer to concede earlier to avoid war with a possibly resolved rival. And learning will occur gradually. So as opposed to, canonical screening models where learning happens all at once in a single costly action, here learning is more gradual as the set of types remaining in the war of attrition gets gradually winnowed. There are additional implications to the paper. This can explain delay. As the original Iraq case showed, countries who continue to try to negotiate and achieve peace undermine belief in their own resolve, which is the peacemaker's paradox, or what I've dubbed that. And then for brinkmanship, it resembles sort of traditional brinkmanship models in that unresolved states are conceding because they want to avoid the risk of war. However, it's endogenous. Here, the risk of war is endogenous because states actively choose to go to war. So I think that's about 15 minutes. So thank you. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Noam. Okay, so before we turn over to the panelists, Noam, I want to give you a chance to kind of, if you want to frame the discussion, kind of let us know where you are with the paper, what kind of feedback you're looking for, and then once we've got that from you, we'll turn it over to the panelists, and we'll just kind of give them each a few minutes to hit the high points of their feedback. So we'll go alphabetical order by last name. We'll let Mark, Peter, and then Jess give comments, and then with the time that we have left, we'll let Noam, we'll let you respond, and then we'll have a discussion. And if anyone, I see we've got some people in the audience. If you have questions or comments, you can put them in the Q&A, and if there's time left over, we'll maybe add them to the discussion, and if not, we'll be sure to pass them along to Noam. So Noam, I'll let you kind of frame the discussion. Tell us where you are with the paper, what kind of feedback you're looking for.
Thank you. So this paper is probably going to go one more rounds of revisions before I send it out. So any feedback that you have on the paper is good and useful. And then I hope to continue, and I've started a few follow-up projects based on this. So I'd appreciate any advice for extensions or anything like that that you might also have and thought we're missing.
Great. Thanks, Noam. Mark, if you want to get us started with feedback.
Sure. Okay. Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed reading the paper. And so I have several comments, kind of going from biggest to smallest in terms of like the scope of the comments. First of all, I mean, I really like this paper. The Furon 94 paper is one that's pretty influential, but has never, to my knowledge, been really expanded on, and I like that's what this is doing. So let me start my comments by saying something that's not so much directed at the paper as the sort of the field and terminology in the field, which is the paper asked the question, do states screen or signal? And my answer is, I don't know, because I don't know what those words mean. And I don't think we as a field have figured out what those words mean. And unfortunately, the introduction doesn't really pin down what those words mean. So again, this is not so much a criticism of the particular paper, but more a criticism of how I think people learn this literature. Because, so how would I define them? Well, so I think I was a little thrown by the discussion of signaling, because to me, the lesson of the costly signaling literature is that that it's not the cost of the signals, that it's not the fact that the signals are costly, it's the fact that they're differentially costly. And the reason that signals are differentially costly in these models is because war payoffs differ. So to say that the resolve types have higher war payoff and thus have less incentive to do this is not quite right. I mean, the fact that their war payoffs are smaller means that the relative, the war payoffs are higher. It means the relative cost of doing these things is lower, which is exactly what makes the signaling work. So I was a little confused by the framing in the introduction of that. Now I agree that, like, normally when we talk about screening models, we sort of mean a situation where something is out there and then we kind of use time to or delay to have us update our beliefs as opposed to an active signal. So it seems to me there's sort of both going on in this model. And so I'm not sure whether it's really the right framing to say that this paper is about screening versus signaling. But again, maybe that's just my confusion and confusion in the literature about what these words mean. I will say that what I would like in the paper, in addition to more clarity on that, is I think the paper could stand in the introduction to have a very clear explanation of how your paper is different from Furon 94, because there's a lot of similarity, and some of the things that you're emphasizing in the paper are really also present in the Furon model. Not all of them, but some of them. So I think a sort of a clear distinction would be really helpful in that. Let me just say two other smaller things. One is that I did find a fair number of typos, and I'll send those separately. The one sort of terminology thing is that there's a lot of discussion of resolved and unresolved. And I was very confused what you meant by that, because for a while I thought, wait, are there only two types, a resolved type and an unresolved type? And I wasn't sure. So I think you mean more resolved and less resolved, but you several times it seems like you're talking about a specific value as a resolved type. And that was very, so I thought, is it the one with the highest war payoff? Is that, you know, so anyway, that kind of terminology was confusing to me. The final thing I'll say just about the model is I do like the fact, particularly that they can stay in forever, because that's a pet peeve of mine about the Furon 94 paper, is that model has an equilibrium that's not discussed, in which everybody stays in forever. And, you know, so it's nice that that's explicitly addressed here. You've also added sunk costs, which are fine. What's a little strange is that these sunk costs only last for a finite amount of time and then disappear, or at least the cumulative amount remains, but there's no additional cost. And I find that a little strange in terms of a modeling decision. I wasn't sure, do you really need that to get the results? What would the results look like if you didn't have that? And it wasn't clear to me, like, the substantive interpretation of that made a whole lot of sense to me either. But anyway, I should stop there. But thanks again. An interesting paper, and I think there's some nice contributions in here. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Brad, I think you're muted. Am I up next?
Yes, you are up next.
Okay. So Noam, first of all, nice job. I emailed you kind of a summary of these comments that I'm going to give right now, so you don't need to write frantically. Okay, so first, here's some things I liked about the paper. So you took that canonical Furon 94 framing and you introduced these sunk cost negotiations. With the Furon model, you get this nice, you get this one horizon where before states are engaging in some sort of conceding, and then after it's all war, whereas you're getting this nice first horizon, states drop out before in concessions, then you enter into these two screening regions, and then you have this possibility of a stalemate. And this is all very different than Furon, which is good. Consider making it a picture, because that's a great picture that you have in your paper. So also you're sort of substantively setting up a good point. While I suppose I haven't thought about signaling and screening as terms as much as Mark has, but it sure seems like signaling is over-identified in the literature. And so I buy that what you're describing here is also going on. Additionally, I think the results here could apply to non-interstate conflict. This strikes me as maybe a pretty good fit for the logic for negotiating with terrorists or not negotiating with terrorists. You don't want to negotiate with terrorists or else you're weak because you're in this crisis with the terrorists who are saying nasty, ill-informed things about you. But, backing down is bad, and getting sucked into war is also a pain, and you can get stuck in this period where you're kind of just waiting for the terrorist group to shut up. Here's kind of the points that I was having trouble with. So you have these two costs to being in brinksmanship, which is first you have audience costs, which are going to infinity. And then you have the sunk costs, which increase to this predetermined point. And then the marginal cost drops to zero. This is described in the paper as the quote here, substantively, this assumption reflects a reality where states can choose to reduce their investments in a conflict if it becomes clear that neither country will go to war or concede. This wasn't super clear to me. It seems like that's a strategic choice. If it is, then that should be in your model. Alternatively, I was thinking, is this like, someone like Tom Cotton creating costs for Obama because it doesn't like Obama's handling of Iran, and then at TIK, Tom Cotton gets tired. But then that's a tricky interpretation as well, because you still have the audience cost going to infinity. Also, I think you're just including that graph of the mids is further confusing this point, because when I look at that, it's like, okay, are the incidents within the mid disputes generating these costs? What's determining those things dropping off to creating zero new marginal costs? Onto another point. So I had some issues with the cases that you selected. So with the Iraq case, in lead up to Desert Storm, and Iran with negotiations over the bomb, both of those states stood to benefit from delay. That's a pretty strong feature of those cases, which isn't mentioned in your model. Also, in your model, you can have both sides declare war. And with the Iraq Desert Storm case, I just wasn't sure what Iraq declaring war against the United States would look like after they had already invaded Kuwait. Yeah, I mean, these cases strike me as like the fear on tying hand sinking costs, or there's a Garanson Hirsch JOP 2017 that seems like a better fit for those cases. Also, there's books that describe Saddam's decision-making in the lead up to Desert Storm. You might consider looking into those if you really want to double down on these cases. Also, so I'm somewhat familiar with the literature on wars of attrition, but I have some gaps, and your reviewers could know even less than me. So I wasn't quite sure how novel the sunk cost terms or how novel these multiple screening regions are. Also on that, if you want to make sure that you're citing just about every war of attrition paper that you can find. And so like the Nail Buff, and then there's a Powell, either international security or security studies paper that's missing from this. I think that's all I'm going to say for now, because I'm probably way over a lot of time, and the discussion is more interesting than me rambling anyways.
Thanks, Peter. All right, Jess.
Thanks. Thanks, Noam, for the paper and the presentation. I'm going to try to focus on comments that I think haven't been, like that I have that are unique so far, and I'll send you everything afterwards. So I really liked the dynamic that you kind of highlight, that you actually term the peacemaker's paradox in the paper, where I think you really get a nice distinction between dovishness and a more kind of cautious foreign policy, which you try to kind of explicate through your examples. I think that's a nice idea to try to bring to the fore. I also liked the accrual of sunk cost as a representation of what's going on in diplomacy. I had some similar kind of questions about the kind of way that it's capped, as Mark and Peter have brought up, but I did find that like the kind of gaining sunk costs as a representation of what you're investing in your diplomatic efforts to be nice and intuitive as it's increasing. In terms of kind of the implications, I thought that it was really interesting, the kind of two examples that you raised of the kind of Gulf War and the JCPOA, but I wasn't quite clear which state in especially the Gulf War case was supposed to be the impatient type. And this is true also in the JCPOA example. I think just like, if you go forward with these examples, connecting that really to the kind of terms that you're using in the model would be really helpful. And I think this also relates to Mark's kind of question about the language that you're using about resolve. To me, it seems like there's a difference between what resolve means for you in terms of what the types are doing, how patience comes into play, and that's kind of getting confused with what's actually happening, which is kind of the cost of going to conflict. I think the way that you're using some of that language is actually just making it more confusing for me. And I wonder if you just try to go through and like make sure that each one is tied directly to the particular example that you're using, it would help me understand more what's going on in each case. So just going through and checking that each time you're being consistent in what those things exactly mean. I wasn't quite sure how Israel fit into your discussion of the JCPOA. That was kind of a big part where it's this third party that isn't in your model. but they seem to be either maybe a stand-in for kind of the Iranian perspective because you can't get that in the secondary literature, or is that another player that has some kind of implications for your model? I was thinking that if that's the case, that that should be represented in some way that isn't at the moment. I thought that the screening phase 1 was really interesting, and I think it would be helpful to build some more intuition in the text, right? This is sort of a preference, but the way that you structured is that you just present all of the model and all of the results right away. And it was sort of hard for me to keep the narrative going. And then you just had 3 different implications all at the end. So to me, that seemed like a unique place to bring in some of the kind of examples that you were talking about, and try to add that into building what we're understanding and taking away from the model. The last thing I'll say, and this is kind of just another alternative for where you could look for additional examples that might highlight what you're describing, thinking about something like an ongoing stalemate case, right? You have that kind of nice result in the model where you can end up in this stalemate forever. And in those cases, like I'm thinking of an ongoing territorial dispute where there's kind of incidental investments in diplomacy or perhaps military posturing. Those might be examples where you're actually able to get descriptions of what's going on and a rationale for why it's not worthwhile to go to war. You're willing to kind of wait in this kind of perpetual stalemate because it's not also worth it to try to concede and bear the cost of foregoing this kind of territorial claim. So thanks again. That's kind of all I'll have for now.
Thanks, Jess. So several of the points, so I'll jump in and give a little bit of feedback before we turn over to discussion. Several of the points that I had thought were raised, so I'll just kind of like Jess, I'll try to focus on things that weren't brought up. So, well, I will echo one thing. So I also had some trouble figuring out what exactly you meant by resolved versus unresolved. At times the paper seemed to, it seemed to me at times that those were equilibrium quantities, that maybe there was some value that I had missed. Admittedly, I didn't read the appendix carefully, so maybe that is the case and I missed it. And at other times it seemed like, you were just kind of giving like a directional description of as you become more resolved or less resolved. So that might be nice to clear that up. And then with the cases, I agree with Jess that it would be really nice to have just kind of start off each of the cases if you're going to, if you're going to kind of continue with trying to use them to illustrate the logic. It'd be nice to start each case with sort of an explicit description of this, this was the more resolved player, this was the less resolved player. This is exactly sort of how the players map on to the model. And this is sort of what the model would expect, because I got a little lost and, obviously the model's a simplification. And, but it would be kind of useful to have some help, like to help the reader kind of establish that mapping, because I got a bit lost, especially, given these cases are, there is kind of more going on that I don't necessarily think that a lot of that stuff is consequential for the point you want to make, but, I think it's dangerous to let the reader do that thinking for themselves to a certain extent. And so it might be nice to have that. Another thing with the, the issue of the third party that Israel has brought up, you might want to, at least throw a citation or think about how this idea relates to the Powell taking sides in wars of attrition model. I don't know that was cited, and that seems like it's kind of relevant, and it might, that might be a thing to think about for, when you're kind of discussing avenues of future work. I have some ideas about extensions and things like that, but I want to put that off until the discussion, because I'd like to hear kind of what you're thinking on those lines before I jump in. So with that, Noam, I'll turn it over to you if you want to kind of steer the discussion in whatever way would be most useful for you. And we've got about 20 minutes left. So, and also for anybody in the audience, feel free to, if you have questions or comments, feel free to throw those into the chat. All right, Noam.
All right, so thank you everyone for those comments. So I apologize if my terminology wasn't clear, and I'm more than willing to accept that. What I meant by resolved, and I guess I should have been clear, is just a state that's willing to go to war as opposed to concede. And unresolved is someone who's going to concede rather than go to war. I guess there's no intuitive reason for that to have been clear, and I'm sorry that I made it unnecessarily unclear. As for the, I'm just going to go through the comments in, I know, in like key order. So, or not, or like the order that I wrote them down on the page. So for the terminology, is it screen or signal? I've received a little bit of pushback before on framing this as a screening versus signaling paper. The reason being that sort of, again, the definition of those terms is not really clear. And that if you want to be really technical about it, as where a signal is an action that a state takes that reveals and conveys some information, the choice to continue negotiating is technically a signal, but because you're taking an action in doing so. However, all the types are willing to do that except for some on the margin. And so what you end up with is a dynamic screening process, like it has both, but it's a dynamic screening process because the set of types willing to take that action is consistently getting smaller and smaller. So you're ratcheting or getting them out. So that's a fair point. I received pushback on sunk costs from all three of you about the sunk costs forever assumption. And to me, that was always, especially when I was solving this earlier on and I set up the utility function incorrectly and ended up with many erroneous terms. That was an assumption that was supposed to simplify and get me out of using a discount factor. But I suppose I can just throw one in there. Because what that would do is cap payoffs and allow states to remain in forever and pay a finite cost for doing so. And so I could do that. And if it's an unpopular move, I do think that that it's ultimately defensible in some way, in the sense that states eventually. I give the example in the paper that said Obama tried to negotiate early on a fuel swap with Iran. It failed. He didn't think about it for like 4 or 5 months. And then Turkey and Brazil announced that they had gotten Iran to agree to it just before sanctions were going to be imposed. And they met with Obama to try to convince him, like, look, Iran's willing to play ball. He says, I hadn't thought about that in 5 months. So that's just my example of it being off someone's plate. And there was also some pushback on the cases. And I guess that, yes, I should do, I guess, a better job of relating it to like the terminology in the model. And I suppose I could. To me, I mean, the model is simplified. There's many possible assumptions that I guess that you could throw into the war of attrition to, like, I guess, alter the, like, this is obviously very simplified, and there's potentially someone could be increasing in strength and war could be becoming a better option the longer you negotiate for, like maybe if you arm or something. And so there's lots of different dynamics that could, or not, there's additional dynamics that could be thrown into the war of attrition model, a third player, et cetera. And I recognize that those might be in the cases and not necessarily in my model. The what I hope to do, and what I hope like comes forth, at least from those cases, is just that actions that are like in the Gulf War case, that actions such as large mobilizations aren't always necessarily perceived as the resounding signals of resolve we'd hope that they'd be. When there's the example that I like is that when Bush, or I can't remember if it was Bush or Secretary of State Baker or something like that, but called up Thatcher to tell her that they were mobilizing troops or sending additional troops to the Gulf. Her first instinct was to be worried about the potential for delay and for additional diplomacy that waiting for these troops to arrive there would achieve. And as for why Israel's in the Gulf War case, I think it's mostly just to show or highlight that maybe a more resolved, like if we assume that Israel had a higher wartime payoff or something to that effect, or a lower cost of fighting than the US did for going to war with Iran, then it would make sense that they would be more impatient. And so you kind of, that's just the, that's why I've thrown them in there, sort of to highlight the distinction between, here we have a player who's like more gung-ho about going to war or more bellicose, and we have another player who's willing to take their time, and that's a sort of tension. between them. And so thank you for those comments. I'm sure they'll make the paper much better in its next iterations. So if there's anything that I missed and that you want to push me on, that or I answered insufficiently well.
Yeah, let me make two brief things. I mean, it's a little more helpful to hear your description for resolved versus unresolved, although it seems like that's going to change over the course of the game, right? So you could start out resolved and then become unresolved, but again, the way it's often written is that this is sort of an absolute kind of constant, right? And the fact that it's relative, yeah. So anyway, that definitely needs to be clarified. The other thing I was going to say about the sunk cost, and you say, well, maybe you have to add discount factor. I mean, you can. The alternative is to not and just have that cost go to infinity, right? I mean, you don't need to have finite payoffs. You already have an audience cost that's going to infinity. I mean, obviously, it's going to change the model. You're no longer going to have types that want to stay in forever. But I'm not sure that's a bad thing, right? I mean, it's a little weird to have a infinite length war of attrition. I don't know, maybe Israel and Palestine is that, but you know, it doesn't seem to me automatically that you need to allow that to happen in the model. I mean, you might explore, if you do add a discount factor, explore the case where, you know, delta equals 1, and so that no types do actually want to stay in forever. Yeah, those are my two comments.
Thank you.
So I don't want to spend too much time talking about the cases, but one thing that I was curious about is, so since you brought it up, do you have a sense of what the concern was about continuing to negotiate?
In which case?
In the Gulf War case.
Oh, in the Gulf War case. So I'll point out that so two things. So first is a minor point that I forgot, and you raising this, it's not an answer to your question, but I think to Peter's. So originally in the Gulf War, they were unsure whether Saddam would strike Saudi Arabia early on. There was like uncertainty. He went for Kuwait, maybe he could do it again. And the balance of power was very unfavorable towards the US and its allies, at least originally, or like immediately after he invaded Kuwait. So there was, I guess, like early on, it made sense that Iraq would potentially escalate the conflict. As for what the concern was for negotiating longer, there was concern, and I think this is sort of borne out by some of the primary sources like Baker and Bush's writings, that that Iraq was being intransigent, that it had invaded Kuwait and done all this stuff, and that Bush would be willing to compromise, or at least like back down without going to war with them at all if they pulled out of Kuwait, even like the day before, after deploying hundreds of thousands of troops and without dismantling any of their offensive capabilities. He would be willing to leave that all intact and just leave. And there was sort of an ethos of, we'll go through with this if we have to, but in reality, any solution that avoids war is the best solution in our eyes. And that wasn't viewed positively by all the allies involved or by all the allies of the administration. There was also just concern that they would get the timing of, there was some concerns about the calendar of the conflict also. If I'm not sure what they were exactly, but that war would become a lot more difficult to do in the Gulf if they waited into February and a little beyond. And so delay beyond that time would supposedly push the start date for a war a lot later. And so they were concerned that they would get locked into this very prolonged stalemate in the Gulf.
Okay.
Those were the two primary concerns of why delay was an issue here.
Okay. So before we jump back over to Peter, the reason I brought it up is that, of those two concerns, it's the second seems like it's less relevant to sort of the logic of the model in the first. And so it might be, that was a note I had made on the PDF when I'd read through, is sort of like, what is that concern? Is it the informational one that is embodied in the model? And that might be nice to just a footnote or something to give some that if you want to, you know, sort of come down hard on the logic the model suggests is actually here. You know, it doesn't have to be the only logic. And that was kind of what my concern was with the case, with that aspect of the case was, you know, is it the case that we're just worried that a war tomorrow would be worse than a war today, when that's not, when that, I mean, I guess because of the screening, it's more likely as we go on, but it's not that the sort of the prospects of success are changing over time. I think Peter had a two finger.
Yeah, I guess then still I have a hard time understanding how the war today being worse is captured in the sunk cost term, which hits the marginal costs of 0. And then I also was then also unclear about, because you were talking about Bush 1, you know, not necessarily wanting a concession, which I think is outside the scope of your model. I guess I found your discussion of the case there very interesting and very compelling, but I wasn't mapping it as clearly to the model as I think you could effectively do.
Yes. So I guess I'd say two things about this, which are, I guess, more unmodel, which if we're going to go into, so I don't model, like you could model or throw into the model something like war today being a better or worse option than war tomorrow. And that's not in the model. And what I'll say is, and I'm not sure how this would work out in practice, but my pushback against is that there's other dynamics in the case that are unmodeled. So war today being worse might be one. The second being, like, I don't know, something about cobbling together an international coalition that takes time and also improves. I know you're standing that way. My pushback would be, and I hadn't modeled to test this, is that I don't know how the screening would, if it would survive or in what form, if you threw in an assumption like that. But just generically, the fact that it is potentially the case that a highly resolved state would still remain impatient and not bother doing all those things. So trying to build an international coalition, which takes time and effort and requires compromises on issues. Though that's like a formal question, like I'd have to throw in that dynamic into the model and see what emerges. But and I reckon, so I think it's fair to push back on this. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I certainly don't claim to know a lot about the real world here, but it seems like the issue as well is that in some of these cases, you know, what's endogenous and what's exogenous starts to get mixed together really quickly, right? So Bush is building a coalition, and one of the reasons he's doing that is to improve the payoff of war, right? So that he doesn't pay a huge political cost. If war comes, he can say, look, I have this whole coalition behind me, and you know, all these other countries are going to support me, and that makes the political costs of war smaller. Obviously, you know, that just gets crazy complicated in trying to think through how a model works, but you know, it's always hard matching these cases to that. But you know, the other thing along the same lines, again, not that I'm suggesting you do this because it's really complicated, is that, you know, there's no actual bargaining in this model either. You know, we have, you talk a lot about negotiations, but it's purely just one side or the other just gives up and goes home. There's no kind of, well, can we, you know, kind of come to some middle ground agreement here? And again, that's in these war attrition models. I'm not recommending you try and put that in there, but you know, I guess to me, it's just hard sometimes to match these real world cases to our, you know, tractable models that have to make assumptions to maintain tractability.
Can I? Oh, go ahead, Noam, sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say that yeah, I'm also sympathetic to that problem of mapping to the real world cases. But one thing that I think that we've already discussed that would be a start in this direction is to kind of remove the dichotomous language around resolved and unresolved, right? So in this case, it seems like Bush is resolved enough, but patient. Is that an accurate description of how you're kind of interpreting the case?
Yes.
Maybe not. I mean, you can tell me, but it seems like just like discussing both your JCPOA and your Gulf War case in terms of like resolved or unresolved enough to generate this dynamic would go a pretty long way in just like clearing up some of the top line confusion. And then you can really get into the question of like, is the mechanism that you're discussing actually present in this case?
Thank you. Thank you. That's all very helpful. I will say, as a small follow-up to Mark's point, I'm trying, but at the moment to introduce bargaining into this. It's not it's not as it's a little more complicated, but I think it's doable. It'll probably take a while though. But that would be a different paper. It's probably not this. So thank you all, because I will be able to implement these comments, and I appreciate you telling me what was unclear in the paper. And so thank you for helping to, hopefully I can implement them in good faith and make it better.
So I'm curious, kind of on this thread of adding things to the model, what extensions, what other, you mentioned that you had some other, follow-up stuff. You wouldn't mind talking about that?
So, I mean, this is maybe getting ahead of myself. So one is I thought I would introduce bargaining. And on that point, I'll say that someone did that with one exit option. There's a Langlaw and Langlaw 2011 paper, or 2012. Yeah, which I really like. And I thought I would try to extend that and maybe throw in some refinements. And so that's what I've started doing. An additional sort of thing I was hoping to do is take it and sort of do something empirical with the paper, because it matches. There's this data, it matches it fairly well and fairly simply. And one of the questions I was sort of interested in asking, and maybe this is a dumb question to answer, but is that Mark and Brenton have a paper, I think, on ultimatums being the best a state can do. And there's some other work, at least in econ, that I was also hoping to follow up with, that a war of attrition is the minimax. So it's like the payoff or form of bargaining. And what I was hoping is A, maybe to show that, but B, to for at least in an anarchic environment, it's unclear to me whether we should expect one state to be a proposer and the other not. And so to maybe I know, test and see if I know stronger states have outcomes that more closely reflect an ultimatum, whereas I know weaker ones do not. So maybe if there's a disparity, it's more likely that one state gets to be that proposer and take the artificial advantage of being proposer and issuing an ultimatum. Whereas if they're closer together, they play a game that reflects that disparity a little bit more as a war of attrition. These are far off projects, some of them, but so that was that. I have additional ones that are even farther off and less thought out. So, but I don't know. We'll see if any of them ever make it through, and in what form.
It sounds like you're keeping busy, which is good.
Yeah, sounds very
good to distract oneself during these times. Yeah,
I suppose so.
Absolutely. So it looks like we're getting up towards 1 Central. So I want to ask our panel if there's sort of any last thoughts, kind of now that we've had the discussion, any like synthesis, anything like that, that you wanted to offer before we give Noam a chance to final response, and then we'll call it a day. All right, Noam, do you have any last response?
I just thank you all for your comments and for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks for the paper. It was a fun read.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I want to echo that. Thanks, Mark, Peter, and Jess for great discussion. Thanks, Noam, for great paper. Look forward to seeing it in print. So we'll wrap up. We'll wrap up for this week. Stay tuned. So we're working on scheduling. So if you are on the Peace Science listserv, you'll get an email soon about our next session. We're trying to work it out, so I don't want to make any commitments right now. But in the meantime, we have if you check out our website, we have a roundtable on race and policing. And that should be posted later today. That's today, Friday the 13th, 2020. That's rough. I just realized that. But that should be posted on the Peace Science Colloquium later today. So check out that roundtable on race and policing. As always, you can find us on YouTube and at our website, and you can also find us on the Peace Science Society website. So until next time, we hope you join us again. Thanks.